Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. This is truly an honor to have Rabbi Brut talk about a topic, a figure, a Talmud Chacham, one of the Gedolei Hadar of the previous generation, the Sameach, the Meshech Chachma, Meir, Simcha of Dvinsk, whose Yahrtzeit is today, the day we're recording this, Daled Elul, and it's his 100th Yahrtzeit. And on a personal level, the Meshech Chachma has always been a Sefer, which is difficult to learn. You can't just read it. Every line is cryptic. There have been, as Rabbi Brot will talk about, people that have worked on expounding what he says. But I grew up in Monsey by a Yid whose name is Rabbi David Schlesinger. And this is a man, for those who knows Kol HaTorah Kula. But the Meshech Chachma was always something special. And having the opportunity to learn and understand the words of the Meshech Chachma through his shiurim was always something that I looked forward to and still look forward to. And more recently, Rav Uren Reich here in Lakewood records every single week a short Meshech Chachma. He expounds on a Meshech Chachma between 5 and 10 minutes, and that's something that I look forward to listening to every week. As again, these are deep. They're all different style pieces, as Rabbi Brot's going to talk about from the Meshech Chachma. There's Pshat, there's Drush, there's Remez, there's Kabbalah, and everything, if I could say, in between. And sometimes all woven together. So just on a personal level, I'm looking forward to hearing and learning more about the Meshech Chachma. Recently, a few months ago, our common friend, Davi Safir, wrote a magnificent article together with Moshe Dembitzer, who did a lot of the research on the Meshech Chachma, which was fascinating as well. And that's available online at Mishpacha's website. But when Rabbi Brot says he's going to talk about a topic or a figure, there's many, many ideas and tidbits that are going to come to life that are certainly not known to most people. So Rabbi Brot shared with me a document about what he wants to speak about in this 3-part series. Part 1, the life and the Torah works. Part 2, personality, relationships, and legacy. And part 3 is going to cover some of part 1 and some of part 2. Because when he sent me this document initially, he was trying to keep it in 2 parts. And in these parts, early life, the Meshech Chachma on Chumash, the Sameach on the Rambam, his prolific Torah knowledge, Kabbalah, Yerushalmi, his family, he had 1 child, his relationship with the Rogatchover, his role as a Rav, his connection to possibly becoming the Rav of Yerushalayim, his relationship with the Chavetz Chaim, Zionism. What was his relationship to Zionism? A letter that's attributed to him. Is it a forgery? We're going to learn about. And the final years and his legacy. And his legacy has been growing over the last bunch of years. But the Meshech Chachma and the Sameach are both Seforim, totally different types, that are staples on every shelf, on the shelf of every Jewish home and Beis Medrash. Without further ado, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Shway, for an excellent introduction over there, accomplishing everything in one introduction. Now, so I'm just going to say very briefly some points to add to what he said. Basically, a few weeks ago, I got an advertisement that there's going to be a full-day conference, which is taking place at the end of it just finished probably right now, in the Gush, where different people are going to speak about different aspects of Meir Simcha. And last week, I got a different advertisement that in Lakewood, which took place last night, there's going to be an event talking about Meir Simcha from Rabbi Uren Reich, Rabbi Geldorf, and Yankel Drolman, talking about different aspects of Meir Simcha. So on Tuesday night, late Tuesday night, right before I went to sleep, I just said, you know what, let me jump into the bandwagon, and I'll also try to speak about it. So I threw out this idea to Rabbi Shwade. Normally, I would not jump into such a thing, as is a known saying, kvar hochel by nemusha, all different types of things, but I felt there are maybe aspects that I'll be able to add. If that's true, only time will tell. So I said to myself, I need some sponsors. Baruch Hashem, I got sponsors for 2 of the episodes. Hopefully, listeners will help out to complete with the 3rd episode. And let us begin just by mentioning one of the sponsors that did help was Mechon Zera Emes. Mechon Zera Emes is a mechon run by a friend of mine, Rav Moshe Habner, who for the past few years has been collecting material of and about the Dolim who did not have children, or even if they did have children, they lost all of them in their lifetime. He has so far published a beautiful Haggadah of the Torah of these type of Gedolim and their lives. He talks about their lives in the Haggadah, and he puts out weekly a Gillion, which is available. One could sign up via email. As Meir Simcha had a daughter, and we're going to learn about that she died in his lifetime, Meir Simcha is one of the people in his vast literature of works that he collects, and we're going to also talk about two other Gedolim that will fall into this category throughout these episodes, and he helped out sponsoring with this episode. Now, as a side point, one last point is that I have a series which is about Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, a deep dive into the Sefer Chashmal Ba'alacha as an excuse to go into all different aspects of Rav Shlomo Zalman. As will come evident at some point in these episodes, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach had a very special chavivas to Meir Simcha, and we'll be able to even see perhaps some connections why that was so, besides from some very solid, reliable oral traditions about him. I even saw brought down, Meir Simcha said he could write a whole book just based on all the messiahs and stories that he heard from his father about. Okay, so without further ado, early memories of Meir Simcha. So I could just say that already when I was about 12 years old, I have very fond memories. The Manal and Chaim Berlin at the time, for the older grades, Rav Belsky, he one time was substituting us, and he came in and he was, maybe it was Parshas Vayera, or maybe it was before Pesach, whatever it was, he sat and he taught us a piece of Meir Simcha. At that time, whatever you could get at that age, had an unbelievable effect. As the years went on, I understood the piece more and more, and already then it had a tremendous impact on me. And as time went on, Lamashal, I still remember at the age of 13 very fondly when I got from Zundel Berman a bar mitzvah present, or Sameach, one of early Sefer, one of my early in my collection. And in my high school years, I remember my friend, who's now Rosh Hashiva in Beis Yosef in New York. So his father, Ramati Yafin, would stay up on Thursday nights or over the weekend, and one of the big things that he would say about his father, this Moshe Yafin told me, was that this Ramati Yafin would hover over pieces of Meshech Chachma for hours on end. So it made a big reishim on me already then. Okay, anyway, so background is like this. Baruch Hashem, there's a nice amount of literature about Meir Simcha. Already in his lifetime, due to a false report of his death, appeared a brief article full of important points about him, maybe 20 lines, written by a tremendous Talmud Chacham. This tremendous Talmud Chacham was, at that time, was the Rav of Petach Tikva, Rav Citron. He was the son-in-law of the Rogatchover. But before he came to Eretz Yisrael, he was zeicha to know Meir Simcha well, and it's evident from the few lines, the pages that he wrote about him, and he signs off the document that was published. The Echad mitalmidei shel Hagoyin Hakadosh. You can say he calls himself even a Talmud of Meir Simcha, and as we'll see, he did not have all that many Talmidim. And there's a very important piece of information already in this document. Okay. When he actually died, the press, when one goes and looks in the newspapers, full of Hespedim. In general, many Hespedim do not add much to understanding a particular gadol, unless the person who's giving the Hesped knew him or decided to say over material from the Nifter. One batch of Hespedim that stands out, which many quote pieces from, which without realizing it was a Talmud named Reb Chaim Charash. And we will, Mirza Hashem, also say over different things from him soon enough. But the point is, this Chaim Charash, already in 1912, when he publishes a Drush Sefer of his, he has in it the Haskama that he gets from Meir Simcha. He says, he gets a beautiful Haskama that he says, this is what Meir Simcha writes about this Reb Chaim Zev Charash. Pamim rabbis ein sforis b'dvar Hashem ze halacha matzasi mali v'gadish b'gemara paiskim v'frap b'chelka yerdei hashmishpa lashon ha'mechaber ha'ma ki matzah harba ben shagadu baki b'divrei g'dayim mechaberim v'lefi erka b'toyr ma'asim toyr roilius Rav Meir b'adak fayda. B'kitzer, Meir Simcha was writing around a beautiful thing. He has a tremendous Kesher with him. At that time, in 1912, already the Kesher was 8 years, but he continues this Kesher until Soif Yamav. He gives 5 Hespedim on him, full of fascinating information, which we'll discuss. And he also had a connection with the Rogatchover. Also, okay. Anyway, sorry. Okay. Another very important essay about the Meir Simcha that was written after he died, which we also will quote from, is written by Rav Herzog. This was written in English by Rav Herzog at the time, and just to say a line about this, the significance is that when I mentioned in the past, I was zeicha to know very well a Yid in Yerushalayim. His name was Rabbi Yahrtzeit. He was a mashgiach, sort of Shalom Eshev in Yeshivas Itri for many years. He had a very big impact on many different people in Itri. And one time we were having, and he was, as to put it mildly, from a completely different camp than Rav Herzog. One time he came up in conversation to talking about Rav Herzog, and he says, Veis was a balabas of kol Torah kula is, the veis nish was a balabas of kol Torah kula is. Rav Herzog was an unbelievable, tremendous Talmid Chacham. It's Yedua for the people at that time without getting involved in politics. So when we'll see what he says about Meir Simcha, how he puts it down so beautifully, we'll get back to that also. And also one other piece that we'll get to is a Talmud of his who writes with initials. We'll discuss his name, who he was. Now, what's absent from many of the early pieces about him is what we know, and you go and you ask someone about Meir Simcha, is Meshech Chochmah. The answer is very simple. As we'll see, Meshech Chochmah was only printed after his lifetime, which we'll get to. Okay, now, clearly, which we'll also discuss, he gets his name in the Torah world from the Gdolim Pashtus is through the Sefer Sameach. As time went on, and after his nifter, more and more pieces were written about him, which we'll discuss. Now, in 1941, his first 15th Yahrtzeit, we find in the newspaper Hatzofer, which in general, it's worth pointing out that newspapers had featured, even newspapers for Hamoinam, featured many Torah articles. And one could find vast amount of information, book reviews about Seforim, about halachic topics before the Yom Tovim, and a lot of times before the Yahrtzeit of a Gadol. So if one looks at the dates of, let's say, Meir Simcha over the years, you always see some good articles. So over there, there's an article from Rav Zev Rabiner, which we'll return to. And then we have Rav Zev Rabiner. Okay, so who is this Rav Zev Rabiner? So it turns out he is the main source for what we know about Meir Simcha, and that's why he deserves special mention. He was a Talmud of Ravinus. He's born in 1895. His father was a Rav. He brought up in a proper Torah background, and he learned by Ravinus. He dies in 1979. Okay. He writes that after Meir Simcha was nifter, he began collecting, this is in 1926, he begins collecting information, everything about Meir Simcha, speaking to everyone, interviewing everyone, and he collects for 40 years information about Meir Simcha. I'm not sure if this 1941 article is the first article, but it's one of the earliest articles that he wrote about Meir Simcha. Eventually, when he gets to Yisrael, he ends up writing a bunch of books about Gedolim. And as a rule, most until he has the source, he did the detective work, he wrote letters, he researched, interviewed, he found great material. In 1967, finally, he publishes his masterpiece on Meir Simcha, and for the fact is that most material about Meir Simcha comes from this work. Whether they attribute it to him or not is a different story, but many Pitaka do. Now, he begins with an important intro, as this is a topic that's very important for him, about the Dolim books, and why it's important to write about our heroes, he calls them. And fine, he thanks the Rosh Bezdin, Reb Shmuel Werner, for helping him in general and encouraging him for his work in Tel Aviv. He was the Sefer of the Bezdin of Tel Aviv. He has impressive askamas, including from Rav Shach. So here we have, just understand, Eretz Yisrael was a different place than today. Here we have a Talmud of Ravinus, who is a Sefer in the Bezdin in Tel Aviv, but he's getting askama from Rav Shach. Amal Rav Herzog writes in a letter how he's eagerly awaiting his work on Meir Simcha. Anyway, fine. Now, back to 19. So, Bekitzer, he's a prime source, and we'll mention different things from his work also. Now, back to Rav Zevin in the 1941 article. So, Rav Zevin, many of his materials.
You mentioned Rav Herzog. Rab Uren Reich shared, and maybe you're going to get to this, that Rav Herzog, after Reb Meir Simcha's Petira, he wrote a few words in a secular, quote-unquote, Jewish paper. He was attempting to convey to the woefully ignorant and indifferent masses the magnitude of the loss. He expressed the generally accepted feeling regarding Meir Simcha with these words. The subject of these lines was, I may say, without fear of contradiction, the greatest Talmudist and the foremost rabbinical authority of the day. Puts it the context of what Rav Herzog was writing about Meir Simcha.
Yes. So that, it's interesting, is where are you reading that from? That when did Rav Reich say that? He said that, or he wrote that?
I was shared this message written by Rabbi Reich. Maybe he shared it as well.
Because last night when he spoke in Lakewood, he says it, but he does not say Rav Herzog's name, and which I found strange. But it's Lakewood, so that they're not going to want to say Rav Herzog's name, even though Rav Aaron Kotler was very close. I have a Kabbalah from Rav Yankel Drulman, who did speak in Lakewood, that Rav Aaron Kotler and Rav Herzog got along very good in learning and everything. But so Rabbi Reich, I suspect, did not want to say Rav Herzog's name, but in writing, he was confident to write it, and we're going to get to this Hesped because it's remarkable. But Rav Zevin, who anyone knows, listens to my material, knows that I am very fond of Rav Zevin. So originally, his pieces were printed in newspapers and in journals. So his newspaper, he writes a masterpiece about the Meshech Chochmah, and then it's published in his Ishim Veshitas later on, updated. The same year, 1941, he wrote an article about Meir Simcha. in the Sinai Journal. Now, I cannot overemphasize the greatness of Rav Zevin's work, Ishan Veshitas, and how it gives you, it's not a historical work, oh, he was born here and there. That's about a page about each article of the 10 Gedolim that he talks about. It's in-depth analyzing the Mahalach Halimon of each of the Gedolim by bringing samples, donning on the samples, bringing out certain things with the unbelievable Clarkite in his learning. It's definitely not a light read, but it's incredible to read, and it has a tremendous impact on a lot of people till today. It's been published numerous times. Okay, anyway, bottom line is eventually more and more work comes out about the Meir Simcha. Just to mention briefly, Rav Cooperman does the famous edition of the Meshech Chochmah, published numerous times. There's a fancy edition of Meshech Chochmah, not complete, from Rav Dam, which is Givaldik, which we'll get to. Eis V'Hadar put out an edition which I have not yet looked at properly, but it's also popular in English this year alone. Just now, Mechon Ali Zayas published a work on Bereshis. Last year, I think it was Rabbi Bernstein from Mosaic Press. They published a work of adaptations of materials of Meir Simcha. So in English, there's a lot of material. Now, like everything else, there's always other materials. There's an academic work from him, from a Yid Yitzchak Kain called Sameach Halacha Mishpat, which we'll also discuss. Okay. Now, there's also real material of Meir Simcha that keeps on coming, which we'll discuss a lot more about it soon. Just recently, I discovered some letters that were never known about of Meir Simcha, which I hope to publish soon. And just yesterday, I got a book that was published by Nachi Weinstein of Seforim Chatter called Kaivetz Torani Ke'ida Rechalim. And in there is a collection of letters, and there is also a beautiful new letter of Meir Simcha that has not been known or discussed in literature. So they're constantly always discoveries, and this adds to our understanding about it. Now, just last nakuda to this introduction is Mishpacha magazine had an article from our friends Dovi Sapir and Moshe Dembitzer, who did tons of detective work, context to put the story of Meir Simcha. You could see the article, the words of the article on Mishpacha magazine, but the original has pictures and documents, which is kedai to see the actual original if one could also. Anyway, so those are just some of the materials about Meir Simcha that's out there, and along the way we'll hopefully mention some more. Now, these shiurim are being said as a mamish, as a nananas of midget on the heads of a giant. I hope to add more inside material about him. Okay, so because of the history of Meir Simcha, briefly for right now, is young, typical. We know almost no stories about him except that he appears to be brilliant. He's born in 1843. There's discussions about his date, but we accept the date of 1843. One story that's said over in all the articles about him is that one time some Rav was trying to get subscribers for a Sefer, which was a very common thing in those days. That's how Seforim got published. It's something you could ask me all about. In order to get a Sefer published, you got to have funding, so you went around getting subscribers. So this Rav was seeking subscribers. He left the Sefer by Meir Simcha's father, and he went to go speak to some Gvirim in the city. Meanwhile, Meir Simcha, who is 9 or 10, he writes a bunch of aras on the Sefer. He comes back, what's going on? What's this kid writing these aras? And he looks at them and he sees different ischayis. They have to rewrite the whole Sefer, or Bekitzer, he was blown away by the aras. Okay, fine. Anyway, at the young age of 13, he goes to Aishashak. His father sends him to Aishashak. So now this period of time of Aishashak, we don't know much about. What we do know is like this. 13 he goes, and at that time, the head of the Aishashak was a Yid Avram Shmuel, who was a Talmud Muvak by the Nachos Davin. Okay, now, many different Gedolim who did not end up in Volozhin ended up in Aishashak.
So, just to add one story that Bruin Reich shared, when he was a young boy, he writes that his genius and Asmada was so uncommon that people would say, es wächst noch a Vilna Gaon. And the Bruin says, although obviously an exaggeration, the analogy itself is staggering. And he says, at the tender age of 12 years old, he was capable of repeating verbatim any passage of the complex Sefer, Urim V'Tumim, which he had a fondness for this Sefer, as his grandfather was a Talmud of Rabbi Eibshitz. Many of today's accomplished Neitari, Bruin says, would struggle to understand a page of Tumim. But Meir Simcha, in his brilliance, mastered it with fluency. And this part that Reb Reich adds is special for those who try to learn Chumash and Rashi, right? What's special about learning Chumash Rashi? Reb Reich says, however, amazingly, as Meir Simcha recalled towards the end of his life, at the age of 14, he recognized that there is more Chachmas HaTorah in one Rashi al HaTorah than all of Tumim. It is with this profound reverence for every nuance of Chumash and words of Chazal, coupled with an incredible knowledge of every nook and cranny of Torah, that he uses to full advantage in Sefer Meshech Chochmah.
Correct. Yes, for sure. Okay, but in Mir Tashem, we will discuss some of those points that he raises over there, but Bottom line is he goes to Aishashak. Fine. Now, in Aishashak, there probably were some Iluyim there that age. We know different people from that period of time in Aishashak, but the bottom line is, the story goes, and this is all based on Rabiner, that there was the chavrusa that Rav Avram Shmuel set him up with was Rav Moshe Dushinsky, who ends up becoming the Rav of Slobodka, author of Chuvas Ber Moshe. For some reason, this is what they call the Rebbe of the Meir Simcha, so much so that in one of the Nuschais, what's his name? Rav Zev Rabiner brings down that someone once asked Rav Dushinsky, "Why don't you ever say that you're the Rebbe of the Rebbe Simcha?" He goes, "What? He also had a Malamed Dardaki. His Cheder Rebbe was also his Rebbe. It's an embarrassment for a Rebbe Simcha that I should be his Rebbe." Now, mind you, this Rav Moshe Dushinsky was a Gara Adam Gadol Admai in the world of Lit at the time. We forgot about him of Avada, but Baruch Hashem, one could learn his Chuvas Ber Moshe, whatever we have, remarkable Chuvas. But the problem is, it's only based on one source of one person saying that he's his Rebbe. I would be very hard pressed to find that he's really his Rebbe. He learned with him. He was old. He was a few years older than him, and he learned with him. And he probably had to do with a lot of the people in Aishak, but we don't really know much about what happened there, other than he most likely just sat and learned. Fine. Eventually, he gets married at the age of 17, Bialostok, and then from there, he's there from 1863 until 1888. What does Rav Meir Simcha do? He just plugs away and learns in the shul. I think the Gemilas Chasadim shul. In the Hespedim from this Reb Chaim Karsh says his father told him, his father seems to was from Bialostok, that in this spot he sat and learned 18 hours a day. Yoimam v'layla. Now, when one, which we'll get to, discusses the genius of Rav Meir Simcha and what he knew, it's not a big deal, be'etzem, because the person was able to just sit and plug and learn for more than 25 years. He had no stellar. He wasn't involved with anything. He just learned. He also was writing, most likely, but fine. Who supports him? His wife. His wife had a store and supports him. From this period of time, we'll see about possibly his relationship with the Rava that was the Einig Yontif. But bottom line is, he sits and learns. We know the legend from sources that between Rabiner and other sources was the Chavel Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Zundel Hutner, one of the Gedolei Litu, who ends up becoming, after Rabbi Avram Shmuel, he becomes the Rav of Aishashak, but he's his Chavrusa, Rabbi Meir Simcha, and they supposedly learn incredible. One of the versions say that's probably where parts of our Sameach is from him. Okay, whatever. But the point is, this Yid also, Rabbi Yosef Hutner, was a Goyin Olam. Again, not someone that the world of today knows much about, but he wrote a bunch of Seforim, and he was his Chavrusa. He plugs away. Eventually, the city of Dvinsk, which was not, we have to stress over here, this is not a little shtetla of 100 families. This is a city with thousands of Yidden. The Litvish Rav was Nifter or Ruvinala. And they were looking for a successor. So they end up, it seems, the Beis Halevi was consulted, probably some other Gedolim, and he recommended Rav Meir Simcha. The connection with the Beis Halevi eventually we'll get to. But bottom line is, the point was that they were ready to take a Yid that had no Shimush Rabbanim Pashtus. He just sat, he was sitting and learning. He was in his mid-40s, but he had Beis Halevi was considered from the Gedolei Hadar at the time. They take him, and already you could see in the newspaper account of in 1888, a letter's written how they're so happy that it worked out to get this Rav Meir Simcha. We heard about him that he's noisechein beineim loy levad b'charifusa b'kiyusa b'chol kedrei hashas v'paiskim, that the Gedolei Hadar said about him, but we see he's a special person. They were very proud about him, and it's already written in immediately when he's on the way to the city. 1888, when he in the newspaper Hayoy. Okay. Shortly in 1889, there's a whole account of Simcha's, a whole event that happens. And again, you could see the city, it seems they're proud of their Rav or Meir Simcha, relating different aspects about him. But the point is, the Kihila loves him, and this is evident from many Hespedim and many accounts again and again, and from accounts that Rabiner was able to find from different interviews and different pieces that the Kihila, the Hamoin Am, they were not able to relate to his Ga'inus. We're not talking about a city that had yeshivas and a klois, let's say, and all these type of things. It was a city of a from city. There were also not from elements, but that's not for this discussion now. But was a proper big city. And the way they related to him was he was a person, he was accessible. He answered the questions Yom V'Layla for whatever was necessary, and they loved him. Now, so much so, and this is again and again, this comes up in a Spedim, and almost every article, even short articles about him, is that in World War I, instead of fleeing, like even many Rabbanim used to, when it was danger, they left their city. It was a danger. Meir Simcha was one of the last remaining people. He stayed in the city the whole time, and he felt that he had to. And there was someone that wrote an article once many years ago where he collects all the different Rabbanim, what they did in different periods of time. Even the Chassam Sefer in the times of Napoleon, the war, and it seems like Chassam Sefer might have changed his mind about it. But he also left the city, and some people say it might be a taina on the Rav. Not.
Maybe you'll get to this. What was his Rabbanis? What did it look like? Did he give drushes in the shuls? And is that something that was done and we just don't have them?
Right. So it's very interesting is that as much what we're going to see in the course of the discussions about him is he definitely was not saying over the Meshachach. I don't even think that 98% of his Sibur could have understood. Forget about our Sameach, the Varts in the Meshachachma. It wasn't shot. Oh, the Ar Sameach is his speeches as a rabbi. But we don't have real accounts of things. We know like sharp lines that he said and stuff like that, which maybe we'll get to mention some. But we don't have accounts of his drasha. Pashtos, he gave the typical, in the standard thing in the contracts of Rabbanim in that period of time, they had to give at least 2 drashas. But we don't know, I'm not able to find a good account if he was a good orator or not. Pashtos, he must have been, because based on understanding how one got a job in that time period in a city, we're not talking about a shtetl, so you really did have to have good speaking abilities, but maybe the Beis Levi was powerful enough. It's unclear. We don't really know. But the bottom line is that the again and again, and this comes out in the Spedim later on about him, and any accounts, they loved him. Now, there's a story that has become famous in all literature about him, but the point of this story is that we have unbelievable sources for the story. So one would say what I'm about to say is some type of Rebbe Shamayfis. It's definitely not a Rebbe Shamayfis. And the story goes like this. The way, I'm not going to get into all the details, but the bottom line is the way the city of Dvinsk is that the water, the river, it's on by a river, and the river seems was about to overflow. And it seems it was a common enough problem, and it would have wrecked a lot of parts of the city. And bottom line is, it's written out in different places. And before getting to the early sources about this, so the water is about to overflow, and it would have ruined a lot of the city. Kitzur, they come and tell Meir Simcha, this is, I think, on a Shabbos. They tell him the city's in danger and everything. Meir Simcha gets up, goes to the water, he davens, the water goes down, and the city's saved. Okay, so now, if I told you this story, and let's say I read the story myself in certain places, I would say a baloney story. The Litvaks got jealous of the Hasidim, so they have to make up a Rebbe Shamayfis about Meir Simcha and plug it in. Now you have to understand, the Dvinsk had a Hasidic Kehila, and that was run by the Ragachover, who's the Rav of the Hasidim. So it could be the Litvish people of the Dvinsk got jealous, and they had to make up a story. The Nakuda is like this. This story, so everyone's fond when you search on the internet and everything. The guy who ends up become the first head of Shabak, who at the time already, when he's writing an autobiographical account, he's a Yid in Dvinsk. He's writing about how he's struggling, how he's reading Kfira and everything. But his father used to always take him into Meir Simcha, and Meir Simcha was always nice to him, even though he knew that he's already not on the beaten path, as they say. So he remembers specifically what happened, and he writes out the whole passage, the Nace and the whole city, and this became the Goyim. Everyone knew Meir Simcha Pravit and Nace Barabim. It wasn't even like a Betzina. And this person, and it's in his autobiographical account. You could see it on the internet. You could see the passage on the internet, but not too many people bothered to go actually track down the book and then to see the whole thing. And he says in the book, he says, it's apropos for the Hasidic Rebbe to have done the Meifis. Means the Ragachover, but it was Meir Simcha who did the Meifis. And he says when he told Yaakov Herzog, the son of Rav Herzog, that he was Zeicha to go to Meir Simcha all the time, he got jealous from him because, as we see, Rav Herzog was a crazy chassid of him. But bottom line is this Nace. So you'll say, okay, this Nace, it has Spedim on him that I keep on referring to from this Talmud Muvik of his. Right away he mentions, number one, the city was grateful to him because he stayed during World War I. And number two is everyone knows the nace that happened. So it means it's not like a nace that they dug up 20 years later, or someone said over a nace. In the Hesped, they discussed eyewitness accounts say it's not a person that heard about it from somewhere else. He saved the city. So and again, you find this in other Hespedim, but the point is, already immediately during the Shiva, this Yid who gave 5 Hespedim, who was a Talmud Mamish from 1912 already, was by the Meir Simcha for 8 years, and close to the Ragachover, says over the story as another Pashut. So Pashut, this Nace is Mamish authentic. Okay, which Bechlal in the Litvish world they're mamaya to discuss about Nisim, but here by Meir Simcha we'll see some other Nisim in a minute, which we'll also understand more about him.
Everyone should recognize the fact that my brother is emphasizing again and again and again. It's like going against his teva and his nature of really saying over a nace from a Litvish Gadol. So
okay, but now I'm going to say one knech from a Hasidic Yid who just told me the following story. So there's a Yid, Rabbi Gedalia Rabinovich. So at one point he was a Rosh Hashiva somewhere in Russia, and he went to Dvinsk. He spent a day in Dvinsk. And they took him that day to see the Hesped, the Matzevas, the Beis HaKfaras, where Meir Simcha was. I don't know it could be he was already moved at the time, but they did have the Matzevas. And he saw interesting lashon, the line 3 in the Matzeva. It says, Makar ha'anova va'chesed va'arachamim. So he felt this is an interesting lashon, this Rabbi Rabinovich. We're talking about Meir Simcha, we're talking about a Litvish Gadol, we're talking about his Asmada, his Iyun, his this, his that, whatever. What's shot in this line? Makara Nava v'Chesed v'Haracham. So he also pointed out to me is that who paid for he didn't have any children, so who paid that were alive at this time? The daughter dies tragically. So who paid for this matzeva? The city. They wrote this nusach. They had this nusach written. So pshat is that number one is he gave a drasha and he spoke about something. So Rabbi, after he gave this drasha, he mentioned the famous story that this nace that I'm just talking about, that is eyewitness accounts. An old Yid comes over to Rabbi Rabinovich and says, I remember when Reb Meir Simcha and the Meir walking back from the water. I mean, say, so now Rabinovich, who's alive today, Baruch Hashem, I just spoke to him on the phone, tells me that he was in Dvinsk and a guy came over to him and told him, I remember the story. So that's part of my aspirus. He says that's shot. This is Rabbi Rabinowitz is telling me this is shot in the line in the Matzeva. It's a very interesting pashtus pshat. He saved the city, but then he said more than that. The same person told him that Meir Simcha knew everything going on in every single family. And that's part of what we see about Meir Simcha. Meir Simcha was a superstars, but the galus that he wrote, this Kuntrus on Zika in Sameach, has no effect in his stellar and his kihila. They didn't know this about him. They knew him as a person, and a lot of times when you read about Litvish Gedalim Rabbanim, they were tough people and everything. Yeah, they answered the questions. That was their job, but they wanted to put their head back in learning. And Meir Simcha was a mas midat. Meir Simcha was a people person he was there for the kihila, and they felt this. And again from the accounts and the interviews that this Rav Zev Rabiner collected, you see this again, and maybe I'll give some samples later on. Anyway, but it's interesting to me is like this. This is all the city of Dvinsk. Well, what I'm saying, this Meifis and this Matzeva, but what about the rest of Europe? What do they know about him? So I came across a passage a long time ago. Rabbi Kamenetsky, he said that in 1933, he gave a Hesped when the Chafetz Chaim was nifter. Why? And his shtetl was Taka Maratzamam. She said, but the Chafetz Chaim, everyone heard of. Okay, but he says, what about when Meir Simcha was nifter? He says, then he did not. Why? He says, no one in his city, the villagers, they appreciate anything about Meir Simcha. Did anyone lose a night of sleep because of his kasha on a Sefer Sameach? The Hamoinam didn't understand it. So now, the Nakuda I'm trying to bring out, what I'm talking about, the Chesed and all these answers to Meir Simcha, this is Dvinsk, which is a city, not a shtetl, but that doesn't affect all of Europe. So now the question is, how does he become famous all over? And that hopefully will have some answers. But anyway, the bottom line is, the answer is, Pashtus is his work Ar Sameach. Why? Because Meshech Chachma, that we today know and everyone loves it, and the yeshiva world loves it, and the regular world loves it, and even Hasidim like to look at the Meshech Chachma, and some of them might even say, up as we see a Hasidic neshama, maybe the Ragachev had an effect on him. Anyway, bottom line is his Ar Sameach is published first in 1902, then 1904, then in 1910. Okay, now those are 3 volumes of his on Ar Sameach, on Rambam, and then later on, after he dies, the final volume of Ar Sameach on Rambam comes out. Now, there's something interesting about the Rambam. This is a point that I'm not the only one that points it out. A lot of people point it out. When you look at the Shar of Meir Simcha, it says in all its form, "Chibur beratzon avinu shebeshamayim." To me, and anyone that sees it, it's something very interesting. It's not a typical lashon. Okay. Now the shaila is this the first place where his Torah is published? I mean, say 1902 is the first time that people outside of Bialostok or Aishashak are hearing about him, or did they hear about him earlier? So the answer is that in 1885, a volume is published called Volume 2 of Meleches Cheresh. This was a volume written by Nocha Aishashak Yid, Rabbi Cheskel Chayfetz. This is about the get Cheresh. Turns out this Yid, this another guy of Lita that no one heard about today, his claim to fame is he's the uncle of Meir Simcha. Now, in 1885, what he does is, before he prints he dies in 1885. So Taka, one of the first mentions I was able to locate of Meir Simcha is, Meir Simcha comes from Bialostok to give a Hesped on his uncle. Okay, say there, he gives a Hesped on his uncle. Did he know his uncle at all? Answer is, in this Sefer is the first place in 1885, many pieces of Torah from Meir Simcha is published here for the first time. And you get to see Meir Simcha already then. He read through his uncle's Sefer and he comments with them, and the uncle has Masamatan, and they're all published here. So the Yedei Davar know that's how Cheskel Chayfetz becomes famous. He's the fetter from the Meir Simcha. But at that time, all the Rabbanim, you could see the amount of Askamas that he got, volume 1, volume 2. So that's part of how, the Olim HaRabbanim were zeichet to hear about Meir Simcha. But Mirza Hashem, maybe I'm going to suggest even a deeper connection between the two of them later on. Bottom line is, they had a real connection, and he writes about him. He says, and this is before he quotes 2 pages from him. K'fayda Rav Agoyin, Meir Simcha ben Gisi Rav Hamuflig, blah blah blah. Okay, fine. Anyway, he quotes a ganze lange shtickle, and every shtickle he has this fascinating stuff going on between the two. Okay, fine. So now you'll say that the Sameach, published in 1902, that's what created his fame, or not? Okay. So Pashtus, that's what I would say. So I'm just going to say a few tidbits relating to this. Number one, the Rav Citron. So Rav Citron already, Meir Simcha, there was a fascinating thing we take for granted. We know everything that's going on all over the world in a few seconds. Something happens in Eretz Yisrael right away in America. Everyone heard about it, except for Shabbos. And even on Shabbos, a lot of times you can hear about things fast. Some guy will give you the information. It seems there was a rumor Meir Simcha died, and it took for a few weeks. People thought he died. There was a Hespedim given all over the world. This is in 1919. Way before he died. And even this Rav Citron, who has connections to Dvinsk, was under the impression that by his father Meir Simcha, the Ragachover, that Meir Simcha died. So he writes a thing about it. So in the thing he writes about the Galus for him, the Sefer Sameach, and he says like this: It's gavaldik, kuloi mali bekiyas, nifl v'sfar yishar, mitzianes beli arichos populis, mashaloi matzachein, eitzachelik yadua shalalindim. Not everyone, although I'm done him, which again you have to understand was a smaller world completely than our world, but not everyone was so to freedom with it. And we'll see some other lashonis that it's clear that they said such a thing. That the Hamoin, even the Yeshiva Sha'ilam that were, so there's famous expressions that certain Gedolei Olim, when they saw his famous countries on Zika, they were blown away and everything. But Hamoinam, even the Yeshiva, you say, I'm now talking about the Torah world, it took time for the Sameach till it took off. Okay. So now there's a famous story, and this story, in every speech about Meir Simcha always has to be mentioned, but I'm just going to add just a new knetch with the story. And that story is like this. In Sameach, in Meiser Sheni, Meir Simcha goes off on a shtickle Torah and a sugya and chulun daf chaf beis. And basically, he's miyashiv a girsa in the Gemara, a handorai with everything. And how does he do it? Based on his expertise with Ibn Ezra, which is, for those familiar with Meir Simcha, Ibn Ezra is not unique for him to quote. He knew everything. Fine. And durch this, it helped understand a Rajba in Torah Sabais. Now this Rajba part he only found out later. Fine. And he writes this, and this is, one could see the shtickle Torah in our Sameach, in I believe it was in Meiser Sheni, and then later on the Chedushim of his were published. The pieces there also, his notes, this piece. Fine. So there's an article published. So everyone knows that Reb Chaim Stein published a piece, an addition to this piece of Reb Meir Simcha and the Rashba and the Ibn Ezra. And this is published for the first time in the 1960s. But turns out, in 1931, 4 years after he dies, another Litvish Yid, under the pen name Shin Daniel, who we know his name is Shapsi Dan Yechai, he wrote a beautiful article about Reb Meir Simcha. And in the article, he says he brings down the following story: that there was this whole shtickle Torah, and that Reb Meir Simcha answered this Rashba Duch and Ibn Ezra. So he says Reb Meir Simcha said that in Shamayim the Rashba was zufrieden with this shtickle Torah. And the Rashba says there was a Yidden. So it means say like this: how do we know? If a lot of times the Mechaber wants to know what do they say upstairs about the shtickle Torah. It turns out Reb Meir Simcha had a dream, and the Rashba said Reb Meir Simcha defended me how I learned Tapasugya based on Ibn Ezra. So the Sefer, there's a Rav of Dvinsk, kilo such a type of story. So it's a Gavaldic story that already was being said over a few years after he dies, and the famous place that it's published is in this Makar Baruch from Reb Chaim Stein in the 1960s. Okay, now, so just to mention two other nakudas for today, and that is as follows. Number one is, we said Rav Herzog, so we started quoting already some passages from Rav Herzog, and I'll just mention just very briefly 3-4 passages. Number one is like this. Rav Herzog writes that one Shabbos morning, while turning the pages of my copy of the Jewish Chronicle, my eyes caught on the caption, obituary notice, the name of Meir Simcha Dvinsk. A bare mention of the fact of his death was all that notice contained. So Agav, for me, was already exciting. Here we see Rav Herzog reading a newspaper on Shabbos. I'm very fond of the topic, and I've written a lot about reading newspapers on Shabbos, and did the Netziv read newspapers on Shabbos and everything. So here we have, he's writing B'Fehesi in a newspaper that he read newspapers on Shabbos. Anyway, then he writes that he was waiting to see if there's going to be any articles, and he means in English, about Reb Meir Simcha. He says, basically, the woeful lack of appreciation for those great men who are great in Jewish learning is... Okay, fine, he talks about this. Fine. And then just to quote two passages, what he says over here. So he says like this, that one is the passage that Ruben Reich said, that you quoted earlier. The subject of these lines is, I may say without the fear of contradiction, the greatest Talmudist and the foremost rabbinical authority of the day. Now you have to understand, Rav Herzog understood Reb Chaim, he talks about Reb Chaim, he knew Reb Chaim, and he liked Reb Chaim. But this is what he's saying. Then he says, Meir Simcha has left a manuscript, a number of works, covering the entire field what is known in Talmudic and rabbinic literature, both halacha and agada, but we could only talk about what was published. Then he talks about Reb Meir Simcha, and he says like this: that magnum opus of Maimonides, which marks an epoch in the history of Judaism, appears to have formed the center of gravity of Reb Meir Simcha's lifelong labors in the vineyard of Torah. Very few before him have so completely sealed, I have a very bad copy of this thing, the heights of a titanic intellect of the immortal sage of Cairo. Maimonides seems to have exercised a peculiar spell over the kinder genius, at once analytic and encyclopedic, of the great Rav of Dvinsk. The halacha offers very little scope for the expression of sentiment, and yet one could see the special love. Bichlal. Okay, he goes on and talks about it, and just let me see if there was one other passage from here. Yeah. He says like this. He's talking about the Sameach. He says the genius of a mastermind. The playful pupil is severely kept out. Logic reigns supreme. Analysis is well represented, but it is exercised upon substance, not upon shadow. Traditional synthesis is accorded a fair share, but it is restricted to the subject matter. It does not wander away and become more rambling. Reb Meir Simcha also leads us back to the original sources, to the Babylonian and Palestinian Talmudim, and to the earlier post-Talmudic authorities. Here and there, he supplements the standard commentaries on the Babylonian Talmud by the original notes, which are often most illuminating. Obscure passages in the Palestinian Talmud, he now and again subjects to a critical treatment, yielding an improved text and a most satisfactory exposition. Then he writes also that at first it did not meet with enthusiastic reception, but Lamais over time they did realize the greatness over there. He also throws in Chumash and other aspects, he says, in this beautiful Hesped. I'm more than happy to share the Hesped. The way I found out about this Hesped many years ago was my friend Shimon Steinmetz. He located it on the internet. Since then, it's also published and quoted a lot. But bottom line is, and that's what we'll conclude today, is that the Our Sameach at the time was not as one would expect. It takes time for genius to be appreciated, and even amongst the loimdim, it took time for it to get accepted, but over time, eventually it did. Mirz Hashem, in the next episode, I hope to map out a little bit to explain more on Rav Herzog and others what it was that he was bringing new to the table. The amount of mefarshim on the Rambam, there are hundreds of mefarshim on the Rambam. So what did Ar Sameach do that was so remarkable? To map this out a little, and then to move on to his other classic work that everyone loves, the Meshech Chachma. Mirz Hashem, this will be in the next episode.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. Fascinating part 1. And we are looking forward to part 2. Anybody who wants to be involved in dedicating, sponsoring these episodes or any other episode and the work of Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut, including Seforim that he's publishing, please reach out to him at eliezerbrut@gmail.com.